I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics. Reviews of Theatrics, The Monster Under the Bed, and Demonology 101. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. They're not looking at us, I hope. We're not a video podcast.
Well, you know, they can scroll through on our About page and take a look at the couple of still shots we've got.
Yeah, okay, they can do that. But this month, for December, Sean and I are going to be looking at two current ongoing and one already completed webcomic, as we do every month. We're going to begin with Neil Gibson's Theatrics. After that, we're going to look at The Monster Under the Bed by Brandon Shane. And then we're going to wrap up with Faith Erin Hicks's Demonology 101. But before we get into those discussions, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And we also have to put in a nice plug for their sister site, mydigitalcomics.com, if you prefer your comics in an electronic format, and who wouldn't, especially if you're listening to a webcomics podcast. They have a lot of the popular titles and great publishers that you're familiar with already, and all of their books come in PDF and CBZ formats that are DRM free, which means that you can copy them around and not have to worry about security passcodes and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's a great setup. And I also have to point out that if you purchase any of the books that you like on mydigitalcomics.com, you get a 5% discount towards your DCBS purchases. So it's a nice little win-win for everybody involved if you want to go to mydigitalcomics.com.
That's right. So whether you like your comics in digital format or in printed copy, you can't go wrong with Discount Comic Book Service and mydigitalcomics.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. So, Sean, we've got a number of things to discuss on this month's webcomics episode. But before we do that, though, we got a couple of emails about last month's episode. And I'd like to share those with our listeners.
Absolutely.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
And one of the things that is so fun about sharing these is it's not just from listeners, but it's from listeners who are also the creators we actually discussed last month. And it's really good to get their reaction. Now, one of the tweets that we got in response to last month's episode was by the creator of Hobo Lobo of Hamlin, Stevan Zivadinovic. and he tweeted out that he appreciated the props. He says, "Thanks for the props, guys. Hobo Lobo is competing for my time with all these other laborious projects, but it will be continued." So he was responding to our speculations over the fact that it hadn't been updated in such a long time, and we were hoping that this was going to be updated and eventually completed. And he says definitely he has plans for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I hear that a lot when you look at any webcomic and it goes for X number of months or weeks or years or whatever, and then suddenly kind of falls off the radar for a little bit. And almost inevitably, it's a creator who's has just other things competing for their attention. And the sad reality is that most of these creators aren't earning a living from their webcomic, so they have to rely on a day job or other freelance work. And it's unfortunate. I would love to see Zavinidich completely work on Hobo Lobo and nothing else, or other things like that, but the reality of the situation is he's got bills to pay like the rest of us, so he's got to divide his time accordingly, and that's something that I think bears refreshing for a lot of people, a lot of readers in particular, is that these creators are working out of a commitment to their projects, but they still have the reality to deal with as well, right?
Well, I'm glad that Stefan took a break from reality and sent us that tweet. So thank you very much, Stefan, for letting us know that you listened to the show, you liked it, and that you still plan on completing it at some point in the future. So we look forward to that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And a somewhat similar message comes from another creator that we discussed last month, and this is Sean Wang. And he has a somewhat similar story, but he sent us his response via email, and his is a little more extended, given that he emailed us instead of tweeting out. And this is a longer email, but I wanted to read it to our listeners. Both you and I already have seen this, of course. He says, "Hi, Sean and Derek. I just wanted to drop you a line to say how happy I was to hear your review of Runners this morning. It has definitely made my day. I also wanted to thank you for the amount of thought and detail you put into the review, which covered a lot more elements of the series than most other reviews in the past. It's always great to hear that people like the characters and appreciate both the story and artwork. Your episode comes at a very interesting time. After completing Volume 2 several years ago, I picked up some freelance work doing illustration work for Lego and Scholastic. Over the next few years, the work snowballed and started to take up the majority of my time. As you correctly guessed, as a freelancer, it was hard to turn down that kind of regular paying gig, especially since I actually did enjoy the work itself quite a bit. As of earlier this year, that work has started to taper off, which works well because I had really been lamenting the hiatus Runners had to be put on during that time. You guys hit the nail on the head when you said someone who spent 10-plus years thinking about a project and developing it would probably have a hard time letting it go, and that was very much the case. After my long time away from it, I am very eager to get back to the series, but this time I plan to embrace it in a more full-time capacity. My current plan is to take the time immediately to fully plot out the remainder of the series, so I know exactly how much work I have ahead of me to see it through to completion. I then plan to jump into Volume 3 and also hope to not take any more significant break in between arcs. As the webcomic has been a bit fallow for a number of years, it was extremely heartening to hear your podcast episode this morning to remind myself that people do like the series and would like to see more. I just wanted to let you guys know that I currently do plan to get back to the series, and I plan to do it in a way that will not be a stop and start as it has been in the past. Please feel free to share any of this info with your listeners, which we're doing now, if you'd like. But I at least wanted you two to know. Thanks again for the fantastic and encouraging review, and I hope to get many more enthusiastic reviews from you on future Runners volumes. Sincerely, Sean Wang.
That's fantastic. That makes me feel better knowing that we were able to reach out to him and provide something useful that he found that he got something out of as well.
Yeah, and it was kind of a long email that he sent, but I wanted to read it in full because I think everything that he said was important, especially within the context of last month's show, where you and I speculated on there probably, we would hope at least, be more to runners at some point in the future. And he did underscore our supposition is that, as you mentioned, people have to earn their money somehow, and not through the webcomics, unfortunately. So he was working for both Lego and Scholastic. So it's good to know that he is coming back to continue runners. And another thing that Sean said in a follow-up email, and I won't read that one, but I'll just mention it in summary. He said that if we wanted to tell our listeners if they liked Runner, one of the things that would really help him is to go to the sites for those two volumes, Runners 1 and 2. Go to the Amazon.com page and you can fill out a review. And if you like the book, write a positive review, because he thinks that will help to generate more interest and really help to set the stage for a third volume. So if our listeners really liked Runners, the webcomic, then, or if you read it in hard copy, definitely head on over to Amazon.com, look up Sean Wang and Runners, and write a review of those. And you can do the same over at Goodreads as well.
Yeah, I've heard that from a few other creators as well. The importance of having good reviews on particularly Amazon, and that's built into Amazon's algorithms in terms of when they're showing, the if you like this, you might like this other thing too. That's partially based on the reviews that are given to it. So the more and better reviews that another book gets, the more likely they are to get a little bit more notice in that respect.
Well, Sean, let's discuss the comics that we have on our agenda for December. And we're going to begin with Theatrics. This is by Neil Gibson, but you also have Leonardo Gonzales on pencils and inks, and Jan Wijngaaard on colors. And our listeners can find this at theatricscomic.com. So that's one word, theatricscomic.com. And this is one that is relatively new. It began its first installment in April of this year, but it comes out rather frequently, several times a week, and so Gibson is already into Chapter 5 of this webcomic.
Yeah, he's. It very much seems like he's got this whole thing written out already. I get the impression that it's done, or at least completed from a story perspective, and he's just he's able to just keep it going the entire time. He's, well, you know what? I was going to go into a little bit about how I've seen him work. I've seen his work before, and I was going to go into a little bit of that. But I think maybe we should step back first and talk about what the story is. It's basically, it's a period piece set in the 1920s, and it stars a character named Rudy, who's this fantastic actor on Broadway, and people love coming to see him. And
the great Rudy Burns.
The great Rudy Burns, and that's the selling point for like any of the shows he's in, and he always gets top billing, etc., etc. Except one night, he's out having a good time with his friends. Prohibition has just been lifted, so he's out having a blast. And
no, it hasn't. It's the 1920s.
Oh, you know what? I'm
and it starts in the Speakeasy.
Yeah, that's right. It's this, but I was thinking of the Speakeasy has a poster on the front that says something about Prohibition, but then it's been X'd out, and I got the impression at first that it was over. But you're right; it's not technically over at that point. In any event, Rudy leaves the establishment a little inebriated, and because of his fame, he's accosted by some thugs. He gets the crap beat out of him, and they take all his money. He's okay physically. He's in the hospital for a while, but his face is so terribly damaged and deformed, he's not even recognizable as the same person before. He tries to go out and get more gigs again once he's healed up, but none of the promoters, none of the agents are willing to put him in any shows because he's just so hideous anymore. So his friend, his partner, comes up with a new plan. He says, listen, okay, you can't get an acting gig now. Let's switch gears. You're a decent fighter. You've already got your nose broken and everything. Let's put you in the boxing ring. And he develops this scheme to develop a character of this almost kind of a Mr. Hyde type of character to go into the ring and beat people up. But then people are coming, in theory, just for not just the boxing itself, but for the theatrics, hence the name, around the character and the show that's in the ring itself. And so then we're seeing, so then most of the story here, honestly, that first portion I told you was, like not even the first chapter. So most of the story is then about this process of Rudy going in, becoming this new character and living the life of this kind of Mr. Hyde type character in the ring, and how he's getting along and trying to become essentially a famous boxer through partially a skill, but partially a level of marketing and storytelling that his friend has developed.
Right, yeah, and his friend's name, I believe, is Buddy, correct?
Yeah, see, I wasn't sure if that was actually his name, or he was just calling him Buddy as, friend, chum, that kind of thing. But
yeah, at first I thought it was the latter, and then as we were preparing for this episode, I went back to look at the context, and at least on one occasion, I got the sense that Buddy is definitely more of a proper name than just a nickname or a designation or a salutation of some sort. So
okay.
I do think his friend is named Buddy. In fact, you mentioned the Jekyll and Hyde quality of what Rudy actually becomes as a boxer. That actually was Buddy's idea. He's the one who came up with it, and he concocted not that elaborate, but I think it's an inventive story that Rudy will play the role of someone who's going to go by the name of the Barbarian Count. And he is someone who is from Eastern Europe, and he came with his family over to the United States. And while here, he and his family were victims of crime, and his wife and young daughter, were killed. He was left beaten and with this sense of revenge, right? And so, the tragedy of his family's death has more or less driven him mad. And so not only does he look like a barbarian or a beast, but he acts like it as well. And so Buddy convinces Rudy that if he wants to do what drives him in life, his big passion, which is acting, right? It's not just the money. He does it because, he makes a lot of money as an actor, relatively speaking, on Broadway, but he also does it because it's who he is. He loves to perform roles. So Buddy convinces him this can only work if you live that role, and you should only break character in front of me. Otherwise, it's off. It's not going to work. And so this becomes, in many ways, I guess, the biggest dramatic challenge of Rudy's life, because he has to assume this role not just up on stage, because as a boxer, he's also on stage, right, as he would be in the theater, but he also has to live the vast majority of his offstage life in the character as the Barbarian Count.
Yeah, and I think that means there's a couple of interesting ways that the story can go. Obviously, like we said, it's still ongoing, so we don't know how this gets resolved ultimately. And there's a lot of different directions that he can take this, I think, which would be very interesting, right? You've got this journey of the character of Rudy, and him trying to live this character part, right? Essentially a lie, for the sake of, earning a living. And there's an emotional toll there. And we're starting to get hints of that, even just, however long it's been, a few months or whatever, the fact that he's living that role full time is from an actor's perspective, that much more challenging than just, the 2 or 3 or 4 hours of a single Broadway production, right? So I think there's something interesting there. There's also the obviously it hasn't been run up too much yet, but there's the concern or potential issue of somebody discovering this and finding out what's going on, and if that happens, what goes on after that, right? I think there's a lot of interesting story potential and a lot of directions this can go in at this point. I'm not sure where exactly, but I think there's definitely a lot of potential interesting dilemmas and directions we can take this in.
Exactly. And you didn't even mention the character Stephanie, and she's someone who doesn't make, or hasn't made so far, that much of an appearance in this webcomic, but she's been in there enough to where we know that she's significant in Rudy's life, and she will probably play a much more important role as the story unfolds. Now, Stephanie's someone who was hinted at early on before we even saw her, and we know from that hint that she is rather wealthy, has a wealthy family, and has some role in Rudy's life, but we don't know exactly what. Because I think when the story opens in the speakeasy where Rudy and Buddy are together, Rudy's talking about drinking champagne and getting drunk, and Rudy makes a comment, something about playing with Stephanie's money, right? So we get the hint that Rudy's been getting money from Stephanie. But then after Rudy has the crap beat out of him, and he basically falls into a bottle where he is sorry for himself. He feels that he has no direction. His life is ruined. And so he just stays at Buddy's place because he's lost his apartment. He doesn't have any more income because he's no longer an actor on Broadway, or even off Broadway for that matter. And so he's really feeling sorry for himself. And this is when Stephanie comes back to the U.S. She had been living over in Paris, but she comes back to the U.S. briefly to New York and then goes back overseas. And she tells Rudy that she likes it in Paris. She's going to go back there. There's the hint that she's met other guys, and that Rudy needs to clean up his act because she's not going to carry him, while he's feeling sorry for himself like this. And so that's when Stephanie comes in, it's like the kick in the butt that Rudy needs in order to get back into the swing of things and to pursue another occupation, in this case, kind of, I was about to say faux boxing, but it's actual boxing, but under a faux character, where he will also be performing as he did on the stage. So Stephanie is probably going to be a much more important character in the weeks and months to come. Now, you had mentioned earlier that this seems to be a story that Gibson probably mapped out a good chunk of, if not almost all of it by this point.
Right.
And you can tell that because I mentioned that this has only been going on since April of this year. But there is a lot of content. I'm looking at the chapter layout right now. We're into Chapter 5. There are 22 pages in Chapter 1, 29 in Chapter 2, 18 with Chapter 3, 31 in Chapter 4, and so far we're up to 17 if you count like the occasional art, in Chapter 5. And the last page that went up of Chapter 5 was December 9th, which was yesterday as we're recording this. So, I mean, there's a lot of story here for this not to have been around for that long. And it updates several times a week.
Yeah. And I kind of hinted at earlier, too, and I know you and I talked about this offline beforehand, too. I'm familiar with Gibson's work previously. He actually, I met him a few years ago briefly. He used to be, I want to say, he had a day job like the rest of us. And he got to be, I don't know, mid-40s or whatever, and said, you know what, I'm kind of getting tired of this. I've always wanted to write comics, so I'm going to take some time off, and I'm going to write comics, and that's going to be my thing. And he dove into it head first. He literally quit his job. I want to say he was an attorney, so he had, a good amount of savings there. So he quit his job and just set aside a bunch of time and wrote. And he got artists together and paid them and put together books, published them himself, spent 6 months or a year traveling across Great Britain and the United States, going to different conventions, promoting it and selling it, and really dropping some coin on that. And he went all out, and that was the first time I was introduced to his work. He had the book at the time was called Twisted Dark, and it wasn't a digital production at all. It went straight to print. He had however many copies printed up and whatever, and that was kind of a horror anthology or a weirdness anthology maybe. And what impressed me about that at the time was that he had written all the stories, gotten different artists together for it. But what impressed me about it at the time was that each of his stories had kind of like these weird twist endings to them, right? Kind of in the almost the kind of classic O. Henry sense, right?
Or, since they're macabre, Twilight Zone.
Yeah, exactly. But what struck me and what impressed me about it was that they were all different. He didn't use, there was, I don't know, a dozen stories in there, 10 maybe, and they didn't use the same twist. None of them used the same twist or same basic idea, which for a single anthology written by a single individual, I thought that was pretty impressive. Each one of these stories, you would kind of expect it just by the nature of, okay, this is the way I tend to think, and this is the way that I write, right? You're going to have like some standardization in how you read things, right? If you read a Chris Claremont story, it reads like a Chris Claremont story, right? If you read a Frank Miller story, it reads like a Frank Miller story. If you read a Stan Lee story, it reads like a Stan Lee story. But what was interesting is that he didn't, Gibson was at least prescient enough to realize that and make a concerted, or seem to make a concerted effort to make a different change or a different impression with each story that he was putting together in the single anthology. So you couple that with the kind of the broader plan that he had of quitting his job, putting time aside for writing and publishing, putting aside time and money for the actual the tour and selling the book and whatever. He clearly has a very good sense of planning, and clearly has is able to look farther out than the next chapter, as it were. So that's where one of the reasons I'm coming to this saying he's got this written completely. I don't know if it's necessarily all drawn yet. I don't know if it's all inked or colored, whatever. But I can almost guarantee you he's got this all plotted out and written out. In however style he actually writes his drafts or whatever. But I can guarantee you, as soon as chapter 1 went up, he knew where this was going. He knew exactly where this was going from day one.
Well, he's got a history of writing behind him, as you mentioned. Now, of the Twisted Dark series, from what I've seen, I think that there are 5 volumes of that have been published in the past. But he's also the writer of other series that are, I guess, more mini-series or more contained titles than Twisted Dark. There's Tabitha, Tortured Light, and The World of Chub Chub. But it says on his website or the website of Theatrics, that Theatrics is his first webcomic. So he's coming to webcomics not as a first-time creator, but as a creator who understands what's needed with the print medium. And so I think that's another reason why we see so many installments over such a short period of time, is that he has this plan. I mean, I would agree with you. It's probably that he has the book completely written. It's just coming out when the art is available with each page or each installment as we go along. Yeah. We should also mention that his books, The Twisted Dark, Tabitha, Tortured Life, these came out through T-Pub Comics, and he's an editor at that publisher. I'd never heard of T-Pub Comics before. Had you?
Well, I think that is him, basically. I think
that is him.
Yeah.
See, that's interesting, because on Amazon, on his author page on Amazon, he's listed as editor of T-Pub Comics. I would think that if that's him, that he would be the publisher.
I think he does double duty. I think because because I know T-Pub has he published other things that aren't by him, that aren't written by him. But I think he acts in that respect as an editor for those pieces as well. But
if he's a publisher, I mean, that's much more prestigious, a publisher or publisher editor.
Yeah. I think that's he might have other partners involved with TPub, right? There might be, it might not be just him by himself, but that's basically the publishing firm that he started up as part of this. Okay, I'm going to write comics. I'm going to do comics as a career change. So if you looked at, I don't know exactly when it came out, as maybe 5 years ago or something. So if you went back to 2010 or 2011, something like that, and looked up TPub, they would only have had Twisted Dark was the only thing out at that time. That was their first book.
And just checking it out on Amazon, I see that the 5th volume of Twisted Dark came out just last month, November 22nd, 2016.
Yeah, he has not been slacking in this. I think whatever work ethic he developed over, his regular life, he charged ahead with that into comics. And he definitely did not say, okay, well, the writer's life sounds awesome, and I'm going to just sit back and write as the muse strikes me or anything like that. He's very much the type that just, I think he recognizes, in part because he didn't start this until he was, a little bit later in his life. Because he didn't start this when he was, 18 or 20 or whatever, he's got that sense. He's got a functional, practical sense of what needs to happen. I think he's done enough research leading up to this to know that in order to make this work, if he's going to do this as a career, he needs to put his butt in the chair and sit down and write. And he's been doing that. To his credit, he has been doing that.
Yes. And I like this story, Theatrics. There are two things about it, though, I want to point out that I don't think are necessarily problematic, but I noticed them. One is, now you mentioned that this is a period piece and takes place in New York during the 1920s. Mm-hmm. And I think from the setting, I definitely get that. Every now and again, the costumes, especially the men, what they're wearing, I don't get that feel that this is set in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, I think that there's less difference between menswear between now and 1920 than there is between, let's say, women's attire between now and 1920. Nonetheless, sometimes the way that, and I guess Gonzales is the artist here, draws the men, or at least their clothing, I don't get a 1920s or pre-Depression feel to it. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a... I think there's... I don't know how to phrase it exactly. I think there's probably just a slight difference in the way suits are tailored,
right?
Like the width of the lapels, whether or not they have pinstripes, how they fit, how they're the women's. To your point, the women's, at least the ones I've seen in here, women's styles seem to be noticeably different, noticeably period. But
not so much the men's.
Not so much the men's. It feels a little bit more kind of generic suit-ish.
Right.
And that's not a problem like when we're in the boxing ring, because, the guys are basically naked anyway. So that's not an issue. And there's a few scenes I noticed, like when they're outdoors, he makes a point of putting a hat on just about everybody in a trench coat. That didn't seem too bad. But yeah, some of the, like I'm looking at one of the scenes where Buddy is talking to another agent, and it could be any time in the 20th century, really, or even 21st century. They're just two guys in a kind of generic office wearing suits. And there's not a whole lot particularly in them that stands out as 1920s. But, there's at least, he seems to have, he's done his research with regards to, I think, cars and architecture and some of that type of thing. That's
what I'm saying. The setting itself, outside of the clothing, didn't strike me as noticeably, potentially problematic. But yeah. I guess it was the men's dress. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention that bothered me a tad more, this is the way that Gibson on the website, and I'm assuming he's the one that maintains this website, has put up in a couple of places pop-up ads. And they're not ads for other products beyond the comic itself, right? But there were one or two times where, as I was clicking through, there was a pop-up box that mentioned something about subscribing to the comics, getting on their RSS feed or whatnot, which, I don't blame them for, as someone who also works with a medium that utilizes, as its blood source, really, the RSS feed. It's good that you can remind people, hey, subscribe to us, right? It's just that when this happened one or two times reading the comic, it bugged me. And there was one place in particular. And now, did you read this on a desktop or laptop computer, or a mobile device like a tablet or phone?
I was reading it on a tablet.
Okay, see, I was reading it on a tablet as well. I can't remember where, but at some point, I think it was at a chapter break, when I tapped onto the next page, or what I assumed would be the next page, I got an ad for, I think it was the Kickstarter campaign, because Gibson had a Kickstarter going on for a while. I couldn't get past that page that said something about Kickstarter. I kept tapping around and I couldn't get where I was going. And so what I eventually did was use it's not called an archive, but I guess the chapter divisions, and had to get to the next page that way. Now, again, it wasn't that much time out of my life, really, but it just annoyed me for several seconds trying to figure out, okay, how do I get rid of this ad for the Kickstarter and get to the next page for the story.
Right.
So, I mean, this is the first time I remember seeing a webcomic that utilizes pop-up ads or ads in ways that kind of interrupt the story flow for me as a reader, the consumption of the narrative, and that bugged me just a tad.
Yeah, no, I've got a pop-up blocker in my browser, so I didn't see those, but I did see that Kickstarter thing that you mentioned. I ran into that as well, and had the same thing. And I think that's the ends up being the challenge or one of the challenges of webcomics is that, you still need to make your money, right? And so you still need to have ads on the site or whatever, but you have to do it in such a way that I think doesn't pull somebody out of the story unnecessarily, right? So if you've got your printed book, right, you can sit down in your favorite chair and, you spend the afternoon reading in your book while it's snowing outside or whatever, and it's, you get immersed in that story. The challenge with a lot of webcomics, is particularly when you're doing like a pop-up or this kind of Kickstarter promo break or whatever that was, it as you're going along, and that's where the annoyance is that it pulls the reader out of the story unnecessarily. Right.
But I just want to mention, though, I don't want to seem like I'm ragging on Gibson here, because I'm not. It only happened on a couple of occasions, and the only time it got potentially problematic was that Kickstarter page that I mentioned.
Right.
Other than that, though, I think that the way that the Theatrics webcomic site is constructed is very readable. I appreciated the fact that you can click on the image and go to the next page. And as we've discussed a number of times on this series, not every webcomic does that, and I think that that's an important thing to do. Also, we were talking about ads. When those ads did appear, it was only for the webcomic itself, so not some product. Right. And I appreciated that. And in fact, one of the things I really liked about the Theatrics site is, from what I'm seeing, there are no ads whatsoever. That if you do see anything promotional, it's just for the Kickstarter campaign. And except for that one aforementioned experience that I had, there's just a small little icon about Kickstarter now live, but of course I think that's over with now. But that's all. So he definitely does not design the site to be an eye irritation. And as we've noted a few times with some of the webcomics we've discussed in the past, a lot of ads can be quite disruptive to the aesthetics, in that the layout of the webcomic, it may not get in the way of the page proper of a particular webcomic, but the layout becomes quite busy. So as you're scanning a page, your attention is drawn to other things beside the latest installment of that webcomic, because the visuals are competing, the ads and whatnot, with the webcomic that you're there to read.
Yeah. And, this is actually a nice touch. At least it works for this story. Pardon me. Is that the background of all the pages is just black, right? So you don't even have, this glaring whiteness spitting back at you while you're reading across your screen. All you do is, you can focus pretty exclusively on the comic itself, which is a nice touch too, I think.
Right, and if you scroll down, then you can get the reader responses,
right.
But you don't have to. But they're not in the way,
right?
And every now and again, there's sometimes there are no responses, but it looks like he has pretty decent audience engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he's because of that, like the effort he put into it, and going around, like I said, touring the U.S. and whatever when he first started. I think he developed some followers. I don't know how big his following is, but I think he's got a fan base kind of built in, which is to his credit.
Mm-hmm. So again, if you want to check out Theatrics, the comic that we've been discussing, you can find it at theatricscomic.com. Sean, let's move to the next webcomic we're going to be looking at this month, and this is The Monster Under the Bed. This is written and drawn by Brandon Shane, and our listeners can find this at themonsterunderthebed, one word, .net. And I didn't check to see if you put in Monster Under the Bed without the, if you'd get that. But the URL that I have is themonsterunderthebed.net.
Yeah, I'm doing a quick check here, and if you do just monsterunderthebed.net, then you get a web ring of children's toys and fun activities. So make sure the definite article is there so you can see this comic.
Yes. Now, we don't have to discuss this yet, but I find it interestingly ironic that without the definite article of the in the URL, you get a page, and I am looking at this now, children's toy stores and fun activities. But if you use the in the URL, you're getting the webcomic that we're discussing now. And I would say that there are a good number of parts of this webcomic that are definitely not child appropriate.
Yeah.
And we don't have to get to that yet, but eventually. Maybe we should give just a basic rundown of what this story is about. Now, this began in November of 2014. It's updated, I think, once a week on Sundays, if I'm not. Yeah, it says on the page every Sunday, so I'm assuming that it's every Sunday is when it's updated. And so far, we are into Chapter 3. So, this one has about as many installments or pages up as Theatrics, maybe not even as many, but it's been around for over 2 years now. We have enough of the story under our belts to where there's plenty to discuss.
Yeah. So
if you were going to summarize The Monster Under the Bed, what would you say is the premise and how it begins unfolding?
Well, we've got this kid in high school. I forget if they mentioned specifically. I think they say at some point he's actually 18, so late in high school, and he is having a relationship with the demon that lives under his bed, and it. Basically starts off with exactly that. They're in the middle of this relationship. They're clearly they consummate it. They've clearly consummated it before, and then we get a little bit of it goes back into a little bit of a backstory on how he came to, how Tim came to meet this demon, and a little bit more into what her life is like and what she's doing. And she doesn't live literally under the bed. There's kind of like a portal to her dimension there.
Right. But that portal is under the bed.
Right. The portal is under the bed. So she still looks like she's coming out from under the bed, but she doesn't actually live there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a lot about their relationship, and then there's the tensions of, basically these two different cultural lifestyles trying to kind of clash together, and Tim's trying to understand her, she's trying to understand his, that kind of thing.
Right. And the point of both worlds that kind of brings them together is cookies, right? Because Tim originally meets Shadow, this monster, this female monster, because she loves cookies. Well, he originally met her because she was stealing his socks. And we've learned a little bit about why, but there's still not enough information there, for me at least. Other than maybe she just likes to sniff socks and that's it. But then in order to draw the monster out, he leaves out some cookies. And so she becomes enamored of human sweets after that.
Well, understandably, everybody loves cookies, right?
Yes, exactly. I'm sure there are people out there who don't, but I think most people do.
They don't count. Yeah. They don't count.
Yeah. Now, I'm glad that you pointed out that at the very beginning of this webcomic, in Chapter 1, we are told, very early on, that he's 18 years old, and I guess Shadow is the monster equivalent of an 18-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Because we do see them a couple of times in this webcomic going at it, and if I can use a Shakespearean phrase, since we're talking about monsters, they're making the beast with two backs. And this gets to that earlier comment that I made about the age appropriateness of putting in the definite article "the" in your URL, themonsterunderthebed.net, because there are parts of this webcomic that can get quite racy. Now, I don't think either of us are offended by that at all.
Yeah.
We're definitely not Puritans. And if I were going to be honest, and, this is maybe the guy coming out in me, I have nothing against cheesecake. Although the way at times that Shane is drawing the cheesecake or the nakedness of these characters. And sometimes it's human, but more times than not, it's the monsters, right? This culture that Shadow comes from. It's the monsters. And his drawing style, we haven't mentioned this yet, it has a very cute manga-influenced feel to it. Mm-hmm. And so at times, for me at least, the combination of the childlike cuteness and the explicitness of, and we're not just talking about monster breasts, right? We're talking about other parts of the anatomy that our, I guess, president-to-be is so enamored of discussing to certain people on mic, or whether he knows he's on mic or not. And so, yeah, there's quite a bit of it in this webcomic. Now, again, it doesn't offend me at all. It's just that there were a couple of occasions where I saw the cuteness, the childlikeness of the art coupled with the TNA, and I'm going, okay, I guess. And I don't know if I want to go to the extent of calling it gratuitous, although I guess it is, because more times than not, it seems to me the nakedness doesn't really serve much, if any, purpose other than to titillate. And again, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with an artist who's telling a story who wants to throw in some gratuitous sex. But it's there. And I guess we're mentioning this because we want our readers to be aware that if they are offended by something like this, then they'll know what they're getting into, because we like to hear from our listeners. It's like, hey, I checked out that webcomic you guys discussed, and I have to tell you, I liked it as well, or we didn't like it. But we don't want to get angry emails. It's like, well, I was listening to your web show or your podcast, and then went online to see this webcomic with my son, and thank you very much for showing us some monster porn.
Yeah, we don't want those emails.
That's right. So we're warning you now. But again, we have no problem with this, or at least I don't. But I can't speak for you, Sean. But but what did you think of the explicitness and the use of nakedness in this comic?
It was there for me. It seemed a little gratuitous in places, but at least the crux of the story is about this relationship, and the fact that that we're really talking about this relationship and how it's developing, and it's a way that you can show, okay, they are not. This is more than just like a little fifth grade romance kind of thing, right? This is clearly like a older kids getting into adults, learning what a real relationship is like.
Right.
So in that sense, it makes sense. I don't think it's gratuitous in that way. I think some of the particular shots are a little gratuitous, but whatever. If you're not offended by a little T&A, I don't think it's. I think there was some gratuitous in a couple of the panels, but it's just there. It didn't really strike me one way or another, other than to mention that, again, this is not something you want to be reading on your lunch break at work while the boss might be walking by.
Right. And not only do we have monster nakedness, but Tim's mother, Ruth, is hot and kinky. Mm-hmm. And we'll just leave it at that. But, another thing I wanted to mention about this, and then we can leave the whole, nakedness thing if we want and talk about the story proper. But this does figure into the story, really. Now, getting back to what you mentioned earlier, that they're 18, right? Mm-hmm. This is where the nakedness comes in, and it first threw me momentarily. At the very beginning of the story, we get Tim, who in essence is speaking to us through narration boxes, right? The reader. And we see his relationship now as he, and I guess she, Shadow, is 18. And, it's a physical relationship. They're having sex. And he's setting a stage and telling us how he and she met. Mm-hmm. And their past lives. And there's a clear transition between the storytelling present and the past that he is recalling in flashback, right? That analepsis. And so I don't think there's any question as to what's taking place when. Although, when I first saw them in bed together, when he's recounting this story, I stopped for a moment and thought, wait a minute now, because when they first met, they were, I think, Tim was in 9th grade, and Shadow was in the monster equivalent, I guess, of a 9th grade class. And so when I see them first meet, I'm going, wait a minute now. I saw them in bed earlier making the Beast with Two Backs. Are they in 9th grade and getting it on? No, of course not. I had to pause for a moment and ask myself the case, because there's not, visually speaking, that much of a difference between their 18-year-old selves and their 9th grade selves. Mm-hmm. Did you think?
Yeah, no, that was the one of the issues I had, is that there was a very good consistency of character, which normally is a good thing. But it gets difficult when you're trying to show a child growing up, right?
Right.
The way that I looked when I was, 14 is a lot different than the way I looked when I was 18. And I think that holds true for everybody. But again, you don't really get that in the story. The characters are so consistent throughout the story that they don't look like they've aged at all visually.
Exactly. And now we do see Shadow. The only time we see her naked is when she is older, right? The equivalent of being 18 years old. But when we see her throughout most of the story, it is during this flashback period, which we're still in the middle of, right? As we're into chapter 3 now of this webcomic. And we see her mostly clothed, but there are occasions where she's back where her dimension is, and she's with some of the others that she's in school with, right? There's other people, females, Midnight, Moonlight, and others that have similar names. And during these times, when she's in her dimension, these female characters, older as well as younger, are sexualized in different ways. And so I think it's easy for a reader to see the younger Shadow, even though she's clothed, in those highly sexualized scenes in the monster dimension, if we want to call it that, and to kind of think that perhaps Shane is sexualizing young girls, even though when Shadow is having relations with Tim, they're both older and of age, I guess. But I guess my point is that when we see the sexualized young female monsters in their dimension, that is another thing that kind of caused me to pause for a moment and try to consider, okay, so now how is he being explicit here? Is he being gratuitous with the sex or what? Again, if you don't have clear visual markers that indicate maturity, right, physical maturity, then I think that Brandon Shane here is walking on thin ice in a way, because again he uses this manga-inspired, very cute style. And when you combine that style with a lack of maturity distinction, that's what potential problems could arise with some readers. Again, you and I don't have a problem with that, but maybe we're being a little over-concerned with our other readers, listeners who are possibly going to be reading this.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's worth mentioning, if for no other reason than to, if you're offended by this, or if you might be reading this in an area where somebody else might see it and become offended. That's right. That's, I think, the main concern.
Yeah. And I think where we are in the story now, where things are starting to get a little complicated, in the monster realm, Shadow, her friend Midnight, and then I guess their teacher, who's named Mother Moonlight, they've just been visited, where we are in the story now by also male monsters. And there are indications and hints that there may have been and there may be things going on between the male monsters and the female monsters, and then gender dynamics and relationships are just starting to be fleshed out now. So, where we are now in, I guess, the middle of Chapter 3, it seems to get interesting in that when it comes to characterization, it's becoming much more complicated and convoluted to a point. Mm-hmm. And so I'd be interested to see where Shane goes with this. But, I guess it'll unfold on a week-by-week basis.
Yeah, I think we're starting to get some of the politics, or what might be some of the politics involved in this, too. I get the sense that we're starting to look at, with some of these characters growing up into adulthood, that we're looking at some kind of betrothing maybe going on, or, uniting of factions through marriage, or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think then that would lead to, and this is kind of a guess on my part, that would lead to the recognition that that the demons here can have a relationship of free will with a human outside of this demon realm, or whatever. And it's, there's politics in there. There's potential character dynamics in there. We haven't gotten to that yet in the story, but that would be my guess on where we're going with this.
Right. So again, if you want to check out this webcomic, The Monster Under the Bed, you go to themonsterunderthebed.net, not monsterunderthebed.net.
Two very different sites. Just beware.
Well, Sean, it's that time of the monthly episode where we check in with Jim McLain and Paul Schultz. For those listening to the Comics Alternative webcomic series, you know that for the past several months we've been talking to those guys about a new webcomic that they're developing, Poe and the Mysteriads, which will launch next month on January 1st. And so over the past several months, Sean and I have been talking with those guys about what they've done, what kind of progress, what kind of planning goes into actually launching a webcomic. And this time around, we're only going to be talking with Jim because Paul was not feeling very well.
Yeah, it sounds like he came down with a nasty winter cold or something. It doesn't sound pleasant. I didn't talk to him directly, but it does. He's definitely not feeling up for a discussion of any sort at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah. But we did get the lowdown from Jim, so let's go ahead and listen to that conversation.
And once again to talk about Poe and the Mysteriads. Normally, as everybody, if you've been listening to the podcast a while, you know that we've been bringing in Jim McLain and Paul Schultz to talk about this Poe and the Mysteriads webcomic that they've been working on and kind of following their development. This week, or this month, we only have Jim is only available. Paul is feeling very under the weather. He unfortunately could not join us for this chat this month. We hope he's feeling better, obviously, and hopefully we'll be able to talk with him again next month and some more updates from him as well.
Yeah, he said it felt like he was gargling glass or something like that.
That does not sound pleasant.
Yeah, that's not a sound that you want to reproduce on a podcast.
No, and he has his own podcast, so I'm sure he's having to put that out too.
Yeah,
not fun.
In fact, I believe he mentioned us on his podcast. I don't know if it was last month or back in October, but it was recently.
Oh, that's because we're world famous now. Okay, so last time we did talk, Jim, I think you guys had kind of not stalled exactly, but you'd slowed down a little bit because you were both trying to wrap up some other projects and trying to get those finalized.
Yes.
So have you gotten that stuff out of the way, and have you been able to move on and get some progress going then?
Yeah. My mother's house has been sold. The estate's pretty much in order. All we have to do now is wait for creditors to show up. So yeah, that's all that personal fun business that comes with the death of a parent. That's pretty much all done. And so, Paul is still in the middle of preparing a place to move to. So and making a new studio, which is kind of cool. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And yeah, so for the most part, our side work is done. I'm still continuing work on my Solution Squad book, but most of my end of that's done. I'm waiting for artwork to come in. So yeah, we had a chance to sit down. I actually went to LaPorte 2 weeks ago, and we sat down and hammered some stuff out and got a couple more pages knocked out.
And in fact, right before we started to record, you sent me and Sean both of those pages that you worked on. And I guess this is pages 4 and 5 of the new comic that will launch, I guess, still in January next month, correct?
That is the plan.
And in our show notes, we will put up a link, if that's okay, where our listeners can see what we're about to talk about here. So on page 4 that you just sent us, we have Poe jumping on her motorcycle and then making her way to the morgue. And then on the next page is where she gets there. We're introduced to a few of the players in this world. Major Henry Habert, Carl Crimshaw, and then Detective Alan Hayworth. And then we're given a mystery as well, a deceased individual.
Yep. Who's mentioned in this page 2 is being Corvus, the Raven themed crime fighter, who used to be her senior partner before she left. Yeah. And so the Scooby-Doo mystery begins right here, because you have to always begin the mystery with three possible bad guys. So one of these people could be bad.
And they're all scowling too, so it could be any one of them.
Well, the big hero of the whole city has just died, so yeah, that's bad, and they're all in kind of pensive moods, and you'll get to see the interaction very quickly. As on the next page, we have a little exchange between a couple of the characters, which will be kind of fun.
Cool.
So you guys are getting things lined up, and you say that you still plan on launching next month.
Should be January 1st, so that's a Sunday, right?
I'm not sure, but
I'm looking at calendar. January 1st is a Sunday, so yeah.
Yeah. So the next time that we talk with you, and let's hope that Paul is a part of this as well, and he's feeling well enough to be on the show, it will already be out, and you'll maybe have initial reaction from readers.
That would be nice.
Yeah, and then you can share those with us.
Yeah. So this is very exciting. So we're 5 weeks ahead. We're gonna do this every Sunday on a weekly basis. So we have 5 weeks in the bank right now. So
let me ask you this, Jim. Okay, so you've got your website. You're putting the finishing touches on it, I presume, for the actual presentation and whatnot. What are you doing in terms of promoting that, at least for the start? Obviously, you're talking with us. We're trying to help get the word out a little bit here. But are you actually doing like full on advertising with that? Are you just going to be shooting messages to everybody on Facebook, or what's your game plan for alerting people that, hey, this is out there. This is a new thing we're trying to promote?
Well, that's a great question, because I wish I'd known how to do this when I launched my first one. Here's how it's going to work. I'm not going to pay a dime, not one thin dime for advertising. There's no way. Paul and I are basically doing this out of our own pockets. I'm writing and doing the lettering, and he's doing the drawing, and I'm covering the website because it's pretty easy. I already have a couple. So when I go out promoting my upcoming Solution Squad book, which will be done in January and maybe released at end of January, maybe February, I'll start going around and doing presentations, typically supporting STEM and STEM comics, of which Poe and the Mysteriads is one. So every time I go out and face an audience where I'm talking about Solution Squad, guess what I'm also going to be to talk about? I'm going to be talking about Poe and the Mysteriads as well. It's like if Solution Squad is not your cup of tea, then I think you might find something interesting in this. It's not colorful teenage superheroes. This is instead a mystery vigilante noir story. But it's still going to deal with science, technology, engineering, and math. So I'll be pumping it in the process of talking about my other materials, which I've been doing for a couple of years now.
Okay. So what about then on day one, right? I presume that you don't have a talk you're giving on January 1st, right?
Nope.
So January 1, are people going to just stumble across it through how I guess?
Through my ordinary interactions, I guess, and Paul's too. Paul,
okay.
And, remember, Paul also has a podcast that people listen to. So
sure.
We do have audiences for other venues, so we can do it that way. But as far as paying, I tried a paid ad through Facebook one time with Solution Squad, and it got more views. I don't know. We might try one because they don't really cost that much. But it's like you can reach quite a few people. But I've got friends out in the publishing and the kids graphic novel world who will at least say something for me if I ask them to. And so at least we should get a couple of initial looks right off the bat. Mm-hmm. But I'll probably wait until we have two. The second page, I think, is a stronger introduction to what's going to happen. The first one's more like a cover or a title page. So I think I'll wait till the second week before I really push that.
So you're going to rely on whatever connections you guys have, but also on social media in terms of getting out the word. So Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, using your accounts to connect with others and then spreading the word that way.
Instagram.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And let's see, what else? You mentioned all of those. I got Pinterest. Got Pinterest, too.
Good. You know, Sean, that was an interesting question. How would you advertise a brand new webcomic? Now, you know, that's something that, as much as we have discussed on our monthly webcomic series, advertising a new title, I don't think that's anything that we've really discussed much or even at all. There's some webcomics that have almost built-in communities, right? So if one creator has a particular following that they can create maybe with someone else another property, and there's going to be some carryover, or someone is a part of a webcomics network, for instance, Webtoons, and it would be that network that helps to get the word out as well. But when you're going it alone, like you guys are, Jim, that becomes a challenging question. How do you spread the word? And you have connections, but how are those connections going to resonate when they begin to spread the word? And might this be a slow build?
Could be.
Yeah.
We're not really worried about it because our investment is so small. Financially, it doesn't really matter. It can take off organically. It can take off instantly. It doesn't really matter to us. The idea for us is simply to continue making more comics. And to do that, we just have to, feel that our time has been well spent. And so far, honestly, I would keep doing this for free. I enjoy so much just lettering over Paul's art, because when we sit down to plot things, it's really fun for me, because we sit down, we plot things out, let's say 4 or 5 pages down the road, by the time he draws them, I forget what it was I wrote. And so I'm often, it's like almost like working Marvel style, where I hand him a plot and then he draws it and then it comes back to me and I write it, like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby used to work on the Fantastic Four. And sometimes I forget what it is that I wrote. And it's like, I have to go back to the artwork and say, what was it I was trying to say here? It's like, well, you know what? Doesn't matter, because this is better anyway. and so I actually had fun this past week lettering this 2 pages, because I honestly had forgotten the inner dialogue on the page where she jumps on the motorcycle. And it's like, what was it she was trying to say here? It's like, I remember what I was trying to accomplish with it, but what was I trying to say? And it's like, I didn't even write it down. We just sit down and we talk about it, and he jots it down and lays it out. It's like, and then I forget and I move on to the next plot point. So we're going to have to be a little bit tighter with our plotting in the future. But for this couple pages, it works out pretty well. I mean, the biggest thing we had to really work out the last visit was what the names of the characters were. The character, the detective, what was the name? Alan Hayworth. We've been calling him Detective AH for a long time because it stands for a-hole. And so that gives you some insight into his personality. And not to say he's good or bad, but he's just an a-hole. And so I wanted his initial to be AH, and we were actually going back and forth. What's his name going to be? I know what his last name's going to be. And so Paul came up with what his first name was going to be. And so we compromised. So, that. So the second page that I did, it's like, I remember what I was supposed to be doing there, just introducing the characters, and then identifying in a dramatic way. At least I hope it was dramatic, identifying the body. And the one thing I'd like to point out is on that last panel, she's already solved the mystery, by the way. She solved the mystery as soon as she looks at him. She knows who killed him.
Yeah. And she says so, too, right?
Yeah, she says so.
I know who killed him.
Right? I know who killed him.
Right.
Yeah. So it's going to be the fun part is now explaining for a long series of pages, explaining how it is she knows who killed him and indeed finding out who killed him. It'll be done in a series of flashbacks and contextual pieces that flesh out the universe that she lives in.
What should we look for next month when we talk to you? I mean, obviously we want to ask about, how you guys feel finally getting things out for everyone to see and what kind of advertising you may have done. But is there something that you would like for us to ask or hold your feet to the fire on when we talk with you in January?
It depends on when you talk to us in January. If it's the first week or two, just ask us what kind of progress we've made. If it's week 3 or 4, then ask us what the reception has been.
Okay, it should be early. It better be earlier in the month because we need.
Yeah,
to
if it's earlier, just ask about what progress we've made, because we're not really worried about how many initial eyes we have on the page as soon as it launches, because it's like you said, it's gonna be a slow build. We understand that, and honestly, we're having a lot of fun making this. It's like and as I said, I'd make it for free. I don't care if it ever makes any money. So. It's kind of fun for me to tell a story that's not the same thing that I've been working on for a long, long time. It's been a nice little break for me to tell a different type of story. I'm a huge Batman fan. Batman's by far my favorite character in comics, and this is a Batman story without being Batman. So I compare it to the Batman Adventures books that were put out in connection with the animated series back in the 90s, and that's sort of the way we're approaching it. It's a done-in-one, self-contained story, told fairly simply with strong, stark graphics. The only thing that really doesn't have is color, which I'm okay with.
Yeah, well, given the kind of comic it is, I mean, it does have that noir feeling, and the black and white is perfect for that.
Yeah. And Paul's block shadows are just simply, to me, perfection. I've been envying him the style of inking that he does. In fact, so much that I asked him to draw a couple of pictures for my Solution Squad book for a prose story with spot illustrations every couple of pages. And I said, this is the very sort of thing that I'd like to see. And so he's been working on that on the side as well. So. Hopefully, I don't think that'll slow him down from doing, a page of this every week. So,
now,
and besides, he gets paid for that.
Yeah. Okay. Since this is the last time we'll be talking with you before your webcomic goes live, what is, and tell our listeners the URL so that on January 1st, in a few weeks, then they can go to this address and check it out.
Mysteriads.com.
Mysteriads.com.
Yes.
So be sure to check that out on January 1st. And soon after that, Jim, Sean and I will be talking with you, and we hope Paul, to find out the latest updates.
Yeah.
And until that time, it would be great if you could go to the Facebook page. If you go to the Facebook page and give it a like, you'll get exactly where everything's going to be found. And that's at Poe and the Mysteriads.
The Facebook page.
Facebook.com/Poe and the Mysteriads.
It is Facebook.com/Mysteriads.
Got it.
Okay.
And there's already, like, the second page is in the banner, stuff like that. There's nothing a whole lot there, but we're just using it as a placeholder. But that's where we can release where everything's going to be launched and stuff like that. It's easy to find, and it's already in existence. So it makes it a little bit easier for you.
Well, Jim, thanks again for talking with us, and we wish Paul the best of health, and we will be talking to you guys on the other side of the new year.
Thanks. Wish us luck on our launch.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that was fun. We appreciate Jim taking the time again to talk with us on the Comics Alternative and telling us about the launch in a few weeks of Poe and the Mysteriads. And we're sorry that Paul could not join us, and we wish him quick recovery.
Absolutely. But as we were kind of saying at the end there, be sure to make sure you're ready, set your alarm or whatever to check out the Poe and the Mysteriads website on January 1st when they're officially launching.
Yeah, and before that, check out their Facebook page.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to look at the third and final webcomic for the month, and this is Demonology 101, written and drawn by Faith Erin Hicks. This ran from 1999 to 2004, and you could find it at faith.rydia.net. That's faith.rydia.net.
Yeah, and this is kind of going along with a demon and human theme. Is I don't think we intended to do that, but it worked out nicely in that sense after talking about Monster Under the Bed. So this is Faith Erin Hicks is kind of got a name for herself these days in comics, but Demonology 101 was, I believe, the first real piece of webcomics that she did, the first extended graphic novel. And it's about the story of a character named Raven. She's, again, a high school student who happens to be a demon, but she's being raised by a human in a theoretically ordinary human society. One of the challenges she runs into initially, though, is that the first 16 years of her life, she was raised in almost an isolation, and certainly cultural isolation. So when she does finally start high school at the age of 16, she has a lot of questions with regard to basic processes. You know, when's lunch and what is this food that they're serving us, and how does the bell system work, and all of that kind of stuff that the rest of us probably grew up with. She's just now learning as a 16-year-old. But she's also as a demon, she has to kind of deal. She's learning about her past and learns and has to deal with these literal demons from her past, as well as figurative ones, along with her adopted human father and some of the things that he did in his past to get to that point. And there's a lot of clashes, both physical and emotional, with his family, with his essentially his life before where we start in the book, and trying to get through that. And like I said, there's a lot of emotional baggage that he has to deal with, but a lot of physical challenges as well.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that many of our listeners probably know Faith Erin Hicks from her work in print, right? From the books that she's done. And I know that most recently she came out with the first book in what's going to be a series. I don't know if it's going to be a trilogy or how many volumes there are, but The Nameless City. And in fact, that's a book that Gwen and Andy Wolverton discussed several months back on one of their Young Reader episodes. But Hicks also has a number of other books that have come out, and many of these from First Second, like The Nameless City. They're Friends with Boys, Nothing Can Possibly Go Wrong, and The Last of Us. And she also has a story in the recent Attack on Titan anthology. Now, for our November manga show, Shay and I discussed the Attack on Titan anthology, and we specifically mentioned Faith Erin Hicks's contribution to that collection. And it was a good story. So Faith Erin Hicks definitely has a name for herself now, especially in terms of comics for a younger kind of readership or young adult readership. But this is something that I think for many probably put her on the map, Demonology 101.
Well, yeah, this was her, like I said, her first attempt, I believe, at really getting her name out there, and in part because it was not. She came to it as an extended story, right? She wasn't just going to say, okay, here I'm going to do this little thing and see if it works or not. I think she was another one where she said, okay, I've got a story and it's going to take me 5 years, and I'm just gonna work on it, and that's basically what she did. Is
right. It's large, it's sprawling, and it's quite complex, but I don't think it's too complex to where it could overwhelm the reader. And one of the things that's impressive about Demonology 101, I mean, this is a very young Faith Erin Hicks who is doing this. And, I mean, yeah, you can tell that this is a very early story from a creator, because it's weak in certain ways, but it's impressive in that I think she handles the storytelling, especially at the beginning, in such a way that the reader doesn't feel like he or she is drowning. And by that, I mean that she doesn't throw everything out at us at once when it comes to the exposition. I mean, there are a lot of characters in Demonology 101, and there's a lot of story that takes place, especially before the point where we enter the narrative. So we should mention that Demonology 101 proper is divided into 5 episodes. Each of the 5 episodes is divided into chapters. Now, there are a couple of other, I guess we can call episodes or volumes of Demonology 101. One is called A Distant Faith, which is a standalone story that occurs completely outside of those 5 episodes of Demonology 101. And then there's a collection of short stories of Demonology 101 that, again, you don't have to have read, or they're not as explicitly connected to the main episodes of Demonology 101 in many ways, like the same thing with A Distant Faith. Again, you can read the first 5 episodes and get a complete story, and then if you want to read more about the Demonology 101 world, you can go on to read A Distant Faith and then a variety of short stories that follow. But in these stories, when we get into, I guess, okay, so episode 1, where we begin, Raven is just about to start high school. I mean, this is not the first day of school. This is the first day of high school. It's her first day of human school, period.
Right.
And it's through this fact that we get the premise or in the exposition that unfolds over the rest of the chapters within the first episode, because we learn that Raven and her adopted father Gabriel, we don't know at first, but he's part of the Jenner family, and the Jenner family is a human family that has a relationship with demons to work with them, but Raven is adopted by Gabriel, who we learn later has broken away from the Jenner family, doesn't even use the name Jenner anymore. And they had been living at a place called the Network. And the Network is an organization that was working against the demons and then the Jenner family. But then something happened soon after Gabriel and Raven left the Network, to the Network, that basically they were destroyed. Almost everyone was killed off. in other words, there's a lot of information that we get in the opening pages of Demonology 101, and a lot more story that further unfolds in the next one or two episodes. But Faith Erin Hicks doesn't just throw everything at us all at once. I mean, she paces things out, and that's impressive for a relatively young storyteller.
Yeah, I think that's the one of the interesting things for me in reading through this is I'm more familiar with Hicks through her later work, right? Her more recent stuff over the past 2 or 3 years. And this is, going back essentially a decade and a half now, right, to some of her earliest stuff. You can see a lot of her storytelling skills kind of developing. You can see she's got a good handle on, how to lay out a story, how to construct a story. She's got a good handle on characterization. And I think what's most interesting is seeing how she's taking a look at this and then comparing that to, Friends with Boys or whatever, some of her later work, and seeing where she's stepped up her game. And I think one of the first and noticeable things is that her illustration style has changed. I wouldn't say radically, but very noticeably.
Oh yeah,
this piece, Demonology 101, definitely has a kind of heavy-handedness and a roughness to it that she
very heavy lines.
Yeah, that she very much smooths things out. If you're more familiar with her recent work, this almost doesn't look like it at all in a lot of sense, because her line work now is a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. This has kind of a roughness to it that I think she was working through at the time. But again, you can still see that she's still got a good handle on her characterization and her storytelling in general. And the art's not bad. It's just a rougher style than I'm used to seeing for Hicks.
Right, exactly. And you can tell that this is an artist who is learning her game as she's going along. And you and I have discussed this before. One of the joys of reading a webcomic is that you get to see the story develop as the artist goes along, and you can even see the artist develop in terms of her or his storytelling skills in their art and their characterization, all of that.
Yeah.
So if you compare Demonology 101 with some of the later stuff, like The Nameless City, Friends with Boys, Nothing Can Possibly Go Wrong, you'll definitely notice a difference, and not just in terms of the art, but also in the way that she does tell her story. You're right that there are a variety of cases where the illustration does seem a little too heavily lined and not as clean, sometimes almost as sketches and not finished art. But also there are aspects of the way that characters interact or the way that she tells her story that you can tell are extremely rough as well. There are a number of scenes where the dialogue is just almost overwhelming. And I was wondering, as I was reading this, if Hicks goes back, if she were to go back and rework Demonology 101, if one of the things she would change is the amount of verbiage that you find within some of the panels. Because sometimes a character is speaking and their speech bubble is almost overwhelming the visuals in that panel, because there's just a lot in there. And I know what she's doing. She's trying to get out some of the complexities of the character interactions and the stories that's being told here, but at times it becomes a little too much.
Well, it's interesting too, is what, since you mentioned that, she had originally, like we said, she started this in 1999. She wrote through and did, the entire book. She got to somewhere around episode 4, and she looked back at episode 1 and said, "Boy, that looks like crap." And she redrew the entirety of episode 1 after she had already completed it. So what's out there currently, if you started episode 1 and read through it, you're not reading what she did in a sequential order. I mean, the story still makes sense. It still follows the same story. But I'd be interested to see, and what I can't get to, unfortunately, is her original episode 1. But it'd be interesting to compare what she did differently from the original episode 1 to the revised current episode 1. And I don't know if that's just if she just touched up the drawing, or if she went back and actually rewrote it in parts. Because she was still, when she did that, she was still in the midst of the story. She just still worked on the rest of the story for another 2 years after that. So I'd be interested to make that comparison to see what her revisions actually were between round 1 and round 2, I guess.
Right. And, there are other parts of the story as well that are a little on the rough side. For instance, character interactions and relationships. I don't know if it's ever, at least for me, completely satisfying the way that the relationship between two humans, Poe and John, who become friends with Gabriel, their relationship, Poe's and John's, it's really explained. I mean, we get a sense that there was a background of relationship between John and Poe. Poe's a woman. But that's not really explored much at all, and so it's just hinted at and left there for the reader to surmise. And in fact, if you look at the front page of Demonology 101, Faith Erin Hicks does a really good job of having a list of the characters and describing who they are and when some of the supporting characters first appear in her story. And how she describes the character John, Poe's ex-boyfriend and a former double agent for Network. Right there, that tells you more than you got from the story. And so I think things like that at times can be a little rough. Same thing with the relationship of Mr. Sachs and the Jenner family. We get some information about this character's Sachs links to the Jenner family, but he seems to leave the family awful quick once we get into this story, and there has to be much more going on there to have him leave the Jenner family and to respond to it in the way he does throughout the rest of the episodes. But that's never really explored much. And so there are some character dynamics that are hinted at, that are lightly touched upon, but are left hanging. Now, they're not crucial for us to understand the main storylines of Demonology 101, but nonetheless, there were those rough moments that had me wondering at times, why exactly is that the case? Or what kind of relationship did these characters actually have? And again, I kind of write this off as, a young new storyteller telling one of her very first stories. And it's a mighty complex and convoluted story, and I think it's well handled here. It's just that this being her first story, there are those kind of thin spots.
I wonder, since she had already... She's clearly shown in that she's got her main story, and she's got then, like you mentioned, a couple of those little side stories or tangent stories. And I wonder if that was part of her intention at one point, was to craft more of those to help fill in those gaps, right? To see, maybe John and Poe's relationship from before where we start in Demonology specifically, or some additional. One of those side stories is about Sachs specifically, so I wonder if she had planned at some point, oh hey, let me do this whole little side series just on Sachs and his relationship with the Jenner family, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's that distant faith story.
Right. And I wonder if she planned on, at one point, doing more of those, right, to help explain that. Maybe she realized that there was, kind of like to what you said, there was only so much she could reasonably craft into this story, and just assumed, oh, well, I'll do a secondary story or a side story to kind of get into the other stuff so I don't distract from the primary story that I'm trying to tell.
Right.
And whether or not that was her intention, and if it was, why that may have fallen by the wayside, I don't necessarily know, but that wouldn't surprise me if that were the case.
Right. This is quite an elaborate and ambitious story, and it's something that our listeners definitely should check out. But we should mention that the reading experience is going to be a little different in a couple of places, and this is because of some problems that Hicks had with, I guess, her web hosting. Now, you can read episode 1, 4, 5 and then the follow-up short pieces as webcomics proper, but episode 2 and 3 are a little tricky, or well, at least quite a bit different. And if you click on, for instance, episode 2, you come to a page and she describes the situation here. She says, due to web hosting problems, Demonology 101 episode 2 is no longer available in a regular HTML format. Since enough people have asked that it remain online, here is a PDF of the pages for you to download. And episode 2 is around 6 meg in size. And she points out that these pages are not very high quality, as they were originally created in 2000, but they are readable. So she apologizes for this little bump in the road, and you read it episodes 2 and then 3 in a little different way that you would read the rest of it. But it's still doable, although you can tell that there are parts of these PDFs, episode 2 and episode 3, where the art does seem rough, if not blurry in spaces, almost smudged.
Yeah, I have no idea what exactly happened that, her system would have crashed entirely or what have you. Actually, though, I did read, I'm trying to think of whose website that was. Oh, you know what? I believe, if I recall correctly, it was Steve Hamaker's. He did Plox. We reviewed a few months ago.
Yeah.
Last
year, yeah.
Yeah. His website just went down entirely. The web host that he
recently.
Yeah, I think within the past month or so. I was just reading about this the other day. His web host, basically, they crashed internally and lost everything that he had.
Oh God.
Yeah.
I hope he had backups.
Well, he did. And he's in the process of getting all this stuff back up and running, but that's, that I wonder if that's something that she experienced as well back in the day, right? She wasn't Faith Erin Hicks at that point, right? She was just still trying to get her name for herself, and it was still early enough in webcomics history that I don't know, and especially for being a relative newcomer to it, I wonder if she did not have any substantial backups of her own at that point. I think anymore, I don't think Steve Hamaker had a big problem, as big a problem as it could have been for having lost his entire website. I think he's got backups of everything, of all the art, at least locally, but that comes from him having worked in webcomics for many years beforehand. And, we've got a long history of other webcomic people telling you, save your work. You cannot rely on the backup systems of your web host. You've got to have your own backups independent of that as well, because they can screw up, or they can have accidents. That stuff does happen. And, Hamaker's a good example of why you need to keep the backups, and I suspect Hicks learned herself the hard way as well.
Yeah, but those two episodes, episode 2 and episode 3, they are readable.
Sure.
In those PDFs, so readers going to Demonology 101 can get the complete story and then the follow-up short pieces beyond episode 5. And I don't know about you, but as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of other examples of comics that deal with these kind of larger, almost mythological competition, violent interaction between, roughly speaking, good and evil, because you have something like this going on with Demonology. But I was thinking of Garth Ennis's Preacher. Now, this is not near as elaborate, of course.
Sure.
But it has a somewhat similar feel, right? Where there is a larger story world that includes angels and demons, or at least powers that are demonic and powers that are non-demonic that they are working against. So, again, I've used the word ambitious with Demonology 101, and I think that's apt.
Yeah, and I would point to, I did some little background reading on this too, as one of her big influences in crafting this was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which has that same kind of, good versus evil.
That's right.
Humans and
Buffy's mentioned several times in this comic.
Yeah, and that's a direct reference. I mean, that's she expressly said that it was watching the Buffy TV show that got her to doing this, and that was kind of where the genesis of the story came from, is that getting her in that mindset, seeing what Joss Whedon was doing there, and saying, yeah, I can do something similar to that and tell my own story as well. So it's definitely got that vibe to it. It's not an original concept in that sense, but she tells it in an original way, right? And
yeah.
I think there's a lot of validity in that.
Yeah, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer makes a lot more sense than Garth Ennis's Preacher, but I never got into Buffy.
You know what? I honestly could not get into it myself either. I
never even tried. I haven't watched one episode.
Oh, I sat down and watched a little bit of it, and it was well done for at least the handful of episodes I've seen. It was well done. I enjoyed them well enough that it's not like I sat back and said, "Oh, this is crap. I'm never going to watch this again." But for some reason, it just couldn't quite click for me. For some reason, now I've gotten into Joss Whedon's other work. Right, I really love. I'm a huge Firefly fan. I'm old school brown coat. I was watching that when I was on network.
Oh yeah.
And his work on Avengers was really good, and some of he did X-Men comics for a while. I enjoyed those, but Buffy just never clicked for me for some reason.
Yeah, I haven't even given it a chance, and not because I didn't want to. It's just I haven't gotten around to it. A really good friend of mine from graduate school used to be really big into Buffy, especially when it was, first run on television. And I would meet up with her every now and again at the annual pop culture conference, American Culture Conference.
Sure.
And more times than not, she would be presenting on some aspect of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and she was telling me how good it was, but I never took her up on her recommendation, and so I didn't see it. I mean, I would if I had the time. I just haven't yet. All these years.
Well, that's part of a problem with that we have as consumers. Is there's a lot of really good stuff out there. I see people talking about all these great TV shows on television now. Stuff that's current, and I'm like, where do you have time to watch all that stuff?
That's true.
And we both had even the stuff that we were talking about today. You and I. We're going back and forth. We pushed out the recording a little bit longer than we wanted to, just because we hadn't had time to catch up on everything.
That's right.
So, it's kind of an embarrassment of riches, you might say.
Yeah. Well, Sean, we definitely had many riches for the month of December. We started off with Neil Gibson's Theatrics. After that, we looked at The Monster Under the Bed by Brandon Shane. And then after a brief touching base with Jim McLain and Paul Schultz, we looked at Faith Erin Hicks's Demonology 101. A
lot of great stuff. Always enjoy whatever we have to look at every month. That's always a pleasure. And this month was, I'll just point out a little bit of an aside. This is the first month that I had never read any of the comics that we looked at. Usually, we'll spitball, hey, let's take a look at these, and I'll throw out something because I'd already read it, or you'd throw something out. And this is the first month where you came out with all three of these, and I had not read any of them before, which is made for an interesting experience for me this time around. Most of the time, I've at least read one of them from day one, or at least earlier.
Huh. Yeah. So I'm sure it was a different kind of experience for you.
Yeah.
And if you want great experiences with your comics, whether they be in print or digital form, you could not do better than to go to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service, which is dcbservice.com, or their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. They have great deals. You gotta check them out. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you think about this month's episode. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message using SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And we're also always interested in not only hearing what you have to say, but taking a look at other webcomics that you might be interested in or have just recently found and like us to take a look at. You can reach us email as well. Provide us some nice handy links rather than trying to spell out long URLs over the phone or something. Anyway, you can email us at twoguys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can email me directly at Sean@comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. And you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways for people to contact us, and we do like to hear from you. And you can be a creator, like we said at the top of the show. Sean and Stevan were, and contact us about our discussion of your comics. Or as you pointed out, Sean, people can get in touch with us and recommend comics that we should take a look at for future shows.
Yeah, absolutely. We're always interested in seeing new stuff. Like I said, this month, this was all new for me, and it was definitely a different and fun experience. I enjoyed that.
That's right. But, this, it just dawned on me, this is our last webcomic episode for 2016. So, Sean, the next time you and I will do this show will be into the new year. So I hope you have a great holiday season and a happy new year.
And the same to you, Derek. And the same to all of our listeners out there. I hope whatever holidays you might be celebrating, that you have a good time, you enjoy yourselves, enjoy some time with your friends and family. And going into the new year, I hope 2017 looks a lot brighter for you than 2016.
Yeah, definitely have a great new year, and we'll see you on the other side. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you next month.